Greetings and welcome to our devotion time. It's great to be with you today. We are going to continue Abram's story, and we're focusing in on Hagar today. And we talked about how Sarah kind of jumped the gun. She had this lack of confidence in God's plan for Abram to have a seed that they would produce the offspring that Abram had so much wanted. And so she turns to Hagar, and we talked last week about the cult. This was culturally appropriate, but it wasn't God's plan. And so I want to look a little bit more in detail at Hagar. And by no means was Hagar providing just a simple substitute for a birthing mother. And we talked a little bit about this last week. This intimate connection between human beings never leaves the participants with no effect. Though it affects a lot emotionally, spiritually, in the soul. The participants are affected. The relationships around them are affected in some way or another. And we might ask, well, how did the marring affect the wills, the minds, the emotions that we talked about a little bit last week of the parties that are involved in our story here? What's the dangerous conduct that's played out at this time? Well, remember that in order for Sarah's plan to work, Hagar needed to remain subservient to Sarah. She had to follow Sarah's instructions and teachings, but that's not what happened. Scriptures tell us this, and says when she, Hagar, saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes, and that's Genesis 16, verses 4. And so, hence, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, so to speak. But again, I want to focus on Hagar. So let's look at her in character and think about her a little bit more as we continue this incredible story that we have before us. We may wish to ask, who is this woman? And so we want to explore this today here. With whom and with what twisted strands of human and spiritual DNA did Sarah call upon Abram to commingle his redeemed soul and his promised family destiny? Well, Abram's DNA had, as we read his story, had been touched by the voice, by the words, by the hand, and the image of the creator of the universe. Abram was pregnant with holiness, with promise, and with a destiny, as we've been reading. And what would be the consequences of commingling all that is holy, this impartation that God had given him, with someone who was, I guess we would say, not holy, that was really outside the people group that God had called. The Hebrews have several areas of study, and there's something called the Hebrew Midrash, and it gives some kind of historical context, some theological context to some things. And I use it as a commentary, and so it gives a little more kind of detail, or maybe some ideas, some imaginings that we could have on what was going on. And so the speculation in the Midrash was that Hagar is a princess of Egypt. That the thought was that she was the daughter of the Pharaoh who had taken Sarah into his harem temporarily, as we read in Genesis chapter 12. And before leaving Egypt, and this is a legend here, that says that Pharaoh was so frightened of what had happened, how God had intervened for Abram, that he sought to assuage the plagues that had fallen upon his nation by giving his own daughter Hagar to serve Sarah as a maidservant. And later, Pharaoh would in the Old Testament stories, this is not uncommon. So later, another Pharaoh would give Joseph a daughter of a dignitary as a wife. So now in our story, Pharaoh is the legend is that Pharaoh gave Sarah his own daughter as a maidservant, and all we're told in Scripture about this woman, however, is that she was an Egyptian, that she was Sarah's handmaid, and that her name was Hagar, an Egyptian name, and it's kind of transliterated in the Hebrew language as, and I won't bore you with the lettering there, but her name does paint a picture, and I want to look at some of the meanings there in the hieroglyphics, so to speak. That's the original Hebrew language, was a picture language, and so sometimes these pictures can help us understand what's going on here. So the transliteration of the Hebrew here for the meanings of Hagar, there are three that popped out at me. So one, Hagar was an Egyptianess. Ancient Egypt was, of course, highly developed, and we've talked about that before. It was a society, a significant society. It had a lot of architecture. It had a lot of marvelous advances of the time. It was not. It wasn't a Muslim or a nation or anything. Islam wasn't a part of that. That didn't come to the 7th century. It wasn't Arab. It was populated instead by the descendants of Ham. And if you remember Noah's story, this was the disrespectful son of Noah, who, though he personally was saved through the flood by reasons of his relationship with Noah, not long after being saved and receiving that salvation, he dishonored his father, making sport of his nakedness. Well, the society in which prevailed in Egypt that Hagar was born was it was idolatrous. It focused not on life, but it focused more on death. It appears from scriptures that Hagar had escaped the idolatry and had, through her interactions with Abram and Sarah, come to worship the one true God. So just how much Egyptian culture attached itself to Hagar by the time of Genesis 16, where we are, is hard to tell. So we see Hagar was an Egyptian. Hagar was a handmaid, the scriptures tell us. This is a status or a vocation. We know from the text that Hagar served as a handmaid of Sarah. The Hebrew word, which our English Bibles translate as handmaid, is, if you have a Strong's Concordance, this Hebrew word 8198, and it's pronounced shifkah. This is the same word used in Genesis 12, verse 16, to describe the female servants Abram received as a gift from Pharaoh when he was cast out. He and Sarah were cast out of Egypt. And the verb root of the Hebrew word shifkah is, it means to spread abroad, and it's in reference to a servant. It implies that the servant is over the course of the servant's tenure. It increasingly gets honor, and there's more trust, and there's more empowerment to act as an extension of their master. The closest English concept that we have is an attorney, a person authorized and designated to act on certain issues, at least as, in a sense, an ambassador or a personal representative, to give orders and to make agreements in the place of their master. It would be similar to what we call power of attorney nowadays. The term handmaid shouldn't therefore have any derogatory sense in our minds. That's not what the Old Testament was trying to convey here. There's a lot of respect that is due a handmaid. There's a lot of confidence that continues to grow for this handmaiden. And Ishmael was not cast out because, and that's her son, who was, Ishmael was not cast out because he was a handmaid's son. And sometimes as we continue to read the story, some of us may think that, and certainly gone down that route before. But actually, we'll find Ishmael was cast out because he personally forfeited the place Abram had made for him in the chosen household by hating and grievously sinning in regards to Isaac. Hagar was not cast out ultimately in chapter 20 when we get to that with Ishmael because she was a bad person or was hated by the Lord, but because Ishmael, a mere lad in his teens, most speculate, needed his mom at the time, and both physically and spiritually there was a need there for him still, and obviously because of some of these bad characteristics that were coming out, Ishmael needed someone that could receive revelation from the Lord for him, and that happened to be Hagar. And that brings us to the third thing we know about Hagar, or her name. There's I guess you would say, a hidden secret within the name that I believe will explain why the Lord had her sent out into the desert with her son. Hagar's name means, word picture-wise, it paints a picture of what her name means as a foreigner who receives. And this is one who receives what I think the Old Testament is describing to us here. It's kind of the first one outside of the chosen people to receive a revelation from God, and that's kind of the picture that's painted in the meaning of her name, that she is one who stands outside the original family of God, and yet God gives to her these same gifts that the chosen people were to be given. And this is obviously rare for people in the Old Testament, like Hagar, who are outside of the line of the chosen people. It's rare for them to receive divine revelation. Now, it happened, but it was rare. But she was one of those rare cases where she receives revelation directly from God. She is therefore, in a sense, first fruit of people outside of the chosen people to enter into the line that Abram had received, and received those revelations directly from God. So Abram received revelations, and we'll find out as we continue her story that she'll receive revelation directly. Hagar is an important person in the Lord's eyes. He honored her in many ways, and we should not regard her as a villain in this story. The Lord certainly did not see her that way. While this Egyptian certainly was not sinless, neither was Abram, and neither are any of us. The Lord tenderly cared for her and honored her with opportunities to learn his ways by living in the household of Abram, and with revelation most of us would die for. How many of us have had wells of living water dug, or at least opened and revealed by angels? Well, that Hagar did, and we'll see that story not too long from now. Well, I'm going to stop there, and we'll continue Abram, Sarah, and Hagar's story in our next meeting together. Blessings. Talk to you later. Bye now.